Hello and welcome to this interview with author Mary Harrington, who was very kind enough to send in a copy of her new book, Feminism Against Progress. Very nice to talk with you today.
Thank you for having me.
If I can kick off with a little passage, because this bit read like a mission statement to me. I'm a survivor of the end of history, and I still struggle with its legacy in body disassociation and a reflexive aversion to constraints of any kind. I doubt I'm the only one trying to reverse engineer a workable mode of life in common from what feels like an ash heap of rubble. So when I spoke to Louise Perry, I said that her book, Case Against the Sexual Revolution, people can watch our interview on the website for that. It felt like she was operating within the paradigm of the people she was trying to advise, and that's why it was a much more convincing thing to do, because I think you can see, and perhaps I've been guilty of this when we've gone over modern dating advice segments and the like, but when you get all these new podcasts like Whatever and Fresh and Fit and the like, where they're talking to women who are operating within the sexual revolutionary or the liberally maximizing paradigm, it feels often like they're talking to only the male side of the audience. And what it feels like is the reactionary feminists, of which you've become quite the spearhead, or the sort of post-sexual revolution lamentation cohort of women that have lived through it and gone, well, maybe that wasn't the best idea for the girls are coming up. They're speaking very much in those women's interest, and so it hopefully will get through to them. So do you mind telling the audience who may not be familiar with your personal story, what was your road to Damascus?
I guess I grew up with a fairly bog standard set of left liberal assumptions, because most of us do. You know, it's in the air. You know, the idea that more freedom is always better by definition. I mean, I came of age in the end of history decade in the 1990s. The last decade before history, to all our misery and sorrow, restarted again with 9/11. My first political memory was actually the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was the beginning of, you know, unipolar America and all of the hubris that followed. And I guess the defining moment of my arriving in adulthood was the end of that with 9/11. So the intervening decade, I guess, was my adolescence, and I left adolescence with a set of beliefs which made sense for the end of history. You know, that we'd settled all the big questions, and well, I mean, to put it very crudely, there was nothing very much left apart from kind of identity construction as a sort of consumer activity, plus, I don't know, sex and shopping. I mean, there was a lot of, you know, shopping malls were a big thing. And in a sense, all of life felt as though it had been turned into a series of literal and figurative shopping malls. You know, we had an endless menu of options that we could select from, and in a sense, you know, ethics was reduced to how we went about selecting from those options. I personally was not a happy teenager. I arrived in adult life having really wrestled with puberty and with being female, you know, personing while female. I guess you could put it that way, and with how it is to be responded to as a sexual object by men when that's not necessarily what you're expecting or even what you wanted. I don't think I imbibed any messaging over the course of the end of history decade, which was well into, you know, the sexual revolution is well bedded in by then. I don't really recall imbibing very much messaging to the effect that actually you should be in a committed relationship before having sex. So I had plenty of, I suppose, what you would call hookups, most of which were not very nice, most of which left me feeling like I'm missing something. So that was one piece. I encountered critical theory for the first time in my undergraduate years. I mean, it hadn't eaten the academy at that point. It was kind of a bolt-on to an otherwise fairly kind of canonical English literature degree. But it completely shattered my worldview, because if you take its ideas seriously, you just can't. The neutral observer is gone. The entire framework for making sense of the world that I'd been raised in was gone. And being kind of a nerd, I like to take ideas seriously. And I looked at this and I thought, my goodness, this literally just ate the Enlightenment, or it's going to eat the Enlightenment once this percolates out of the academy. I mean, 20 years on, I think that intuition was correct. Yep. You know, we are somewhere quite different, and it's all downstream of the postmodern turn. But you know, being the nerd who takes ideas seriously, I took that, my newfound love of the internet, which was really just becoming a mainstream thing, plus my general kind of state of being at an angle to the world, plus all of that added together amounted to an aversion to being embodied, a set of very complicated and unresolved questions about sex difference and what it means to be a person in an inescapably embodied in a sex dimorphic in our sex dimorphic condition, plus a whole series of unanswered questions emerging out of critical theory about how or if at all we can encounter the other authentically, or really whether reality is stable at all. I mean, all of which adds up, as you can imagine, to a fairly unstable cocktail of kind of not very well balanced young adulthood.
Yeah, it's a turtles all the way down approach.
It is completely. It's very disturbing, very disorienting. I mean, I look at a lot of the sort of unhinged edge to campus activism now, and I see a lot of deep psychic distress, which I think is connected to just taking that paradigm seriously, or not realizing that you don't have to be nihilistic. You can see that world. You can see the world that way without being nihilistic. But anyway, this is all conclusion. This is all stuff that it took me a while to figure out. You know, recovering from brute postmodernism. You know, the very bleak version of postmodernism took me, I reckon, about 15 years. And from the other side of that, I can tell the story fairly coherently, you know, as a sort of moderately well-functioning adult. But it took a long time. And I suppose I spent my 20s trying to find ways of making sense of the world, which took on board the postmodern turn, and which felt like an authentic way of living, which was aligned to this aversion to hierarchies, the skepticism towards meta-narratives, I think is the famous phrase, and the discomfort, or the desire to how to put this, to make my body mean what I felt it should mean, rather than what it felt like the world was telling me it ought to mean.
So to bring it into alignment with the interior authentic self.
Yeah, I guess, you know, in as much as I was at all confident about having such a thing.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't believe, as some people seem to now, that there was some sort of pre-existing authentic self that ought to be kind of manifested in the world. I was a lot less certain about that. It was more that I was just doing thought experiments with the relationship between inside and outside, and, you know, to what extent I could change reality just by sheer force of will, or sheer force of conviction. I mean, that I suppose is probably the governing theme of everything I was trying to do. You know, to what extent can you just reorganize reality just by how you act on it, or how you think about it? And that included thought experiments in how people respond to you if you change your name, or how you change your self-presentation. I spent a lot of time playing on the internet with other people who were very, particularly there was a sort of nascent genderqueer community that's, I mean, again, it's very much bigger now, but it was a very small subcultural thing in the early noughties. And I spent a lot of time just playing with that. You know, if you construct a sort of imaginary self in collaboration with other people on the internet, what happens when you try and bring that self offline and interact, you know, in those terms in the real world? You know, we didn't know. You know, there certainly wasn't this bureaucracy of recognition which has coalesced since. It all felt very, very radical, very subversive, very something which was coming out of left field, and which was being it felt very creative and very sort of genuinely liberatory. I mean, I have some questions about the way that's been recouped by a larger set of commercial interests now, but I guess that's the same happened to punk, didn't it? That's the way these things go. Anyway, so that was where I was. That was approximately where I spent my 20s. It all sort of fell apart slowly and then all at once.
Much like bankruptcy, yeah.
Yeah, much like bankruptcy, or, you know, revolutions generally.
Which seems to be the direction wider society is going in at the moment.
Slowly and then all at once.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've told this story in a few different places, but the key features were, you know, the business which I helped to start imploded. I was a main contributor to the implosion. I lost my whole social circle. I mean, it was about the most kind of thoroughgoing, full-fat quarter-life crisis you can imagine. It was really brutal, and it took me a while to recover from that and to reassemble some sort of functioning worldview from it. And the fact that it happened concurrently with the Great Crash, pretty much it felt as though what was happening in my inner life and in my social life was happening out in the world as well, because the 2008 really was the end of that sort of economic hubris, where the end of Gordon Brown's conviction that we'd found a way to end boom and bust, and actually everything was just going to go on growing forever, and credit derivative swaps. I don't know. I mean, it seems mad now. Well, maybe not actually, because they're kind of still doing it.
Well, we're going to, according to my colleague Dan, who has an excellent series on the website called Brokenomics, where he explains all of this, he says that at the moment they're desperately trying to make the cheap money borrowing crisis, which has been the novel bubble burst, shift it off somewhere else. And all that's going to do is kick the can down the road to one final explosive crisis where all the debt is just unpayable. We're going to have to rebuild. So not great to coincide with massive identity crises as well that have been born out of postmodernism and maximising liberalism.
No, indeed. But I think that rattling sound is indeed the sound of a can, being propelled further down the road.
Yeah.
And I suspect that probably can't go on indefinitely. And what happened to me was the kicking the can of eternal deferral of meaning ever further down the road in terms of my personal life. That just kind of hit a wall as well. I mean, at the end of the day, you can play, if you live in an ivory tower, you can play these games with meaning, because in a sense it's just academic papers. But when you're trying to do it in your actual life,
you run aground on the rocks of reality eventually.
A little bit, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's not as though I ever did anything irreversible to my physiology.
Yes.
Other people did, and other people do.
I've had a chat with Richie Herron from that very same chair, and his story is harrowing, and it's extra sad because he's such a lovely gentleman. And the conclusion was for him that I've augmented myself in such a way that I'm nearly unrecognizable, and I can never have the same deep relationship with another person that I've always wanted, and definitely doesn't deserve that. And he seems to have dedicated his life not just to hopefully successfully suing the NHS, but to ward everyone off from making the same mistake. And it's a noble endeavour, but it's sad that he's been consigned to that role. Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, long story short, it all fell apart for me, and I decided that I was going to have a go at just being normal. Having tried reinventing all of the wheels, pretty much from first principle, and come to the conclusion that was A, exhausting, and B, not even very satisfying. I thought, well, normal people seem to be having a much nicer time, so maybe I should just have a serious go at being normal, and see if that's just a better way of being. So I don't know. I guess maybe that was even just another thought experiment. What if I try doing it like this, and how does that feel? And it turned out that actually a lot of the ways in which you can be normal or not be normal are actually good. Not all of them. I still question some of them. But that kind of sustained thought experiment in being normal, and where that has a lot of pros which are underrated by the be extraordinary in every possible way ideology, probably forms the personal foundation for writing this book. In the course of that, I came to the conclusion that I just didn't believe in progress anymore. I didn't believe in the basic, the fundamental premises of the liberal project, that things could just go on, things could go on getting better forever. It came to seem just implausible. It was very obviously to me no longer what was happening around us. The number of crises that we've had since 9/11, all add up to. I mean, if you're still convinced that never-ending progress is a thing, I would politely suggest that you haven't been paying attention for a good 20 years now. Or that you're an ill-motivated actor who hopes to be the steward of that inexorable arc in order to empower yourself.
I couldn't possibly confirm or deny how. It's perfectly possible that there are people who just view it like that as well. To be honest, I think most people who genuinely believe are just capable of a great deal of cognitive dissonance. Most atrocities happen out of a sincere conviction. And I think, just straightforward Machiavellian bad actors are relatively rare. I mean, it is very easy to be cynical about the great many grifters who seem to be exploiting, this kind of polycrisis that we're all now inhabiting. I think, and it is very easy just to imagine that they're all sort of laughing in smoke-filled rooms about how they're manipulating the chuds in order to make a big fat pile of money. And there are probably some people who are capable of that level of just overwhelming evilness. But for the most part, I think people people do bad things because they think it will be good. And yeah, I mean, the communist revolution didn't happen because people wanted it to be, because people thought people just wanted to kill millions.
Oh, I have a video coming out on that very soon. That's my exact theory, actually. So,
what, the people actually did just want to kill millions?
Yes.
Well, I'll look forward to the video. And I mean, and the same goes for the other totalitarian ideology of the 20th century, which I'm not going to mention here because we can't invoke that law just yet.
Yes.
But
two cheeks, same backside.
Two cheeks, same backside, same peak modernism, yes. Arguably. And it's, I reckon, most of the people who got stuck into that either went along with it because they couldn't see any, because they were trying to fit in, or they were genuine believers.
They wanted a sense of belonging to a constituency that is meant to bring history to its foreordained end, because by that it gives you a deep sense of, I am on its right side, and it imbues me with all the moral legitimacy that quiets my screaming conscience.
Right. So it's perfectly plausible to me that a lot of what I see as really not very positive changes in the world at the moment, following a similar pattern. People are doing them because they really believe that it's right and it's proper and it's good. So that's kind of my personal background, and then the final piece of that was that in the course of doing my best to be normal, I got married and had a baby, and that was really what put the final nail in the coffin of my liberalism, because it just became obvious to me that the ideal person in the liberal paradigm is just not, being the ideal person in the liberal paradigm is just not very easily compatible with being a mother, and therefore, if I was going to try and square my feminism, which I still. I've always taken women's interests seriously, and felt for personal and also sort of general theoretical reasons that women's interests are often underrepresented. I just came to the conclusion that if the basic liberal paradigm has a blind spot where mothers are concerned, I can either go the way of liberal feminism and just edit mothers out of my feminism. Or I can either conclude it's a mother's problem and embrace liberal feminism, or I conclude it's a liberalism problem, and try and just rewrite and have a go at rewriting the entirety of feminism to make sense of, in alignment with my progress atheism, which is I suppose where I ended up, sort of accidentally coining the phrase reactionary feminism, which kind of started as a joke, really. I mean, it wasn't it's sort of a meme first, ask questions later kind of a moment, in the sense that I stuck it on my bio as part of a long running joke with a friend.
Yeah, because you said to Benjamin Boyce that you'd had a sort of argument in DMs with a fellow academic. Yes.
An extended argument via Twitter DM about the meaning of post-liberal, or whether or not it even had any content. And I stuck reactionary. I switched from post-liberal to reactionary, just by way of conceding the argument. I was like, okay, fine, you win. Post-liberals are just reactionaries who don't inhale. So
that's quite good. I do like that.
So and then I realised it just worked as a sort of thought scrambling device. It let me fly under the radar for a long time, because people would either read feminist and be like, oh, okay, she's one of us, or they'd read reactionary and think, oh, okay, she's one of us, or they'd read both of them together and just be like, what the flip, and just ignore me. And it meant I got to go on for much longer than would perhaps otherwise have been the case, without anybody putting serious effort into cancelling me.
I do think, harping on that cancellation, because I can't remember, it might have been Peter Whittle that asked you, have you been cancelled yet? And you said, not really, and I expected more. And Louise gave a kind of similar answer in another interview she did before I spoke to her. And I think it comes back to the fact that this book bleeds with sincerity, as does Louise's, as does Abigail Favale's, as does Helen Joyce's, even though hers is even more controversial. I think it's because people can see that you are actually addressing a concern within inside the paradigm of other women who have suffered at the hands of the ideological denial of biology, the sort of extrication of motherhood and embodiment from being female and growing up, going through the stages of maiden, mother and matriarch. And I think it's because even though they're commanded to commit to liberal feminism, they do have that suppressed conscience, that gut feeling that something isn't quite right here. So I think that the Overton window is shifting just because it is apparent that you are speaking from within women's interests. So I think that's why this has got quite the warmer reception than you were expecting.
It has been a lot. It has been a lot less angry than I expected. I mean, there have been one or two people who've just had a bit of a meltdown, but
that's always happens.
But I was expecting more, and it wasn't the people I expected at all.
I wanted to go slightly onto your thesis statement then, because, you might disagree that this was the one that I pulled out, but you did say, my aim in this book is to make the case that those challenges addressed by feminism are less evidence of an eternal male animus than effects of material changes. And throughout this, you've created a dichotomy between the feminism of care and the feminism of freedom, and that how a lot of technological pressures as we went from agrarian to industrial to post-industrial technological economies have pushed out or entirely colonized in the discourse the feminism of care for the feminism of freedom. Do you mind elucidating that dichotomy for people who aren't familiar?
Yeah. So the first third of the book I spent setting out, I suppose, a materialist reread of the history of feminism, where I've set out to show that while it's usually framed, or at least the story that I absorbed as an adolescent, was that feminism was just prima facie evidence of progress. You know, this is the number one thing people point to, and when you say I don't believe in progress, they be, what about women's rights? And they'd be like, well, yeah, but when I say I don't believe in progress, I don't mean that I think things are getting worse. I mean, I think some things get better and some things get worse. Yep. That things just change, and then you end up with different trade-offs. So what I set out to show in the first part of the book was that all of those. The women's movement was not so much evidence of moral progress in an absolute sense as the aggregate of women's responses to radical changes in how men and women live together over the in the course of industrialization, and perhaps the central shift in that forced a whole renegotiation of how family life worked was the departure of work from the home. And I mean, you can argue ad infinitum about women's relative greater or lesser access to formal or informal power in the Middle Ages. But one thing that's not in dispute is that for most families, work and home were the same thing. I mean, if you were a smallholder or even a subsistence peasant or a small scale artisan or whatever, everybody worked in the household because work and family life were essentially the same thing. And most of what we now think of as work in the sort of economically productive sense wasn't really understood. It didn't really come with pound signs attached. It didn't come with money attached to it. It was just part and parcel of ordinary life. So producing subsistence goods for the family, or the care of children, or any number of other or processing raw materials into clothing, for example. None of that constituted work in the modern sense of I do this thing and in exchange I get money. You do this thing and in exchange your kids have some clothes to wear. Yep. And it's just it doesn't come with a transaction attached to it at all, because
you're
it's
more
just
directly connected to the products, your actual labor.
Right, exactly. So in that context, men and women both worked. They just did different. They had distinct roles. Which varied a great deal, and there was men's work and there was women's work, but everybody worked. And the only situation in which a woman didn't work at all would be if in extremely aristocratic strata, which were really just not very many people at all. And even then, a woman in that context would have. It's not as if she'd just sit around all day. She'd be managing a household, for example. Which if you have many servants is probably a full-time job. So all of that happens naturally. If you're a peasant mum, you've got kids underfoot. You might have animals to look after. You might have your raw materials to turn into subsistence goods for the family. You might have 2 or 3 kids running around. So you've got your hands full, but you're economically active and on equal terms with your spouse in the context of a productive household. And in that world, the household was understood as the basic unit of society, not individual citizens as it is today. And that's a significant shift to wrap your head around. And that's the context in which access to formal political power was really contested in the 19th century, when women started to demand the vote. Because what happened in the 19th century, give or take, a little bit earlier in Britain, a little bit later in the United States, was that work began to bleed away from the home. So, for example, textile making, which for tens of thousands of years had been women's work, was increasingly centralized in factories with heavy machinery and very different working conditions. And under those circumstances, it's not something you can do while you're talking to your extended family and minding the toddler. It's suddenly taking a toddler into that setting is an extremely stupid and dangerous thing to do. And so you're faced with a new dilemma. How are you supposed to do both of those things? And those women who could afford it let go of being economically active, and so that's the genesis of the bourgeois housewife that you start to see in the 18th and 19th century. And I've traced all of this out in detail.
Yeah. So you spoke about the cult of domesticity.
The cult of domesticity is, and I've slightly pushed back against the liberal feminist reading, which I think has been the dominant one since the 1960s, of the cult of domesticity, where these women, this was a very prolific body of writing in the 18th and 19th centuries by women who were extolling the benefits and the virtues and the elevating moral importance of the woman in the home, the angel by the hearth, and whose job was to make the home nice, to create a space of respite from the rigors of competition in the market society, and who took charge of the moral education of children. And what they were really doing was making the case for the fact that the domestic realm was still important, even though work had bled away from it, and which to me reads very straightforwardly as a form of feminism. Because if that domestic space has no value to it, then what are you even doing there? And they understood that domain contains a huge amount that's important and valuable about human life, and set out to mount a defence of it. In a context where actually in practice they'd lost a lot of emotional agency, and were no longer in a position to wield power directly. As for example, you might have been able to in a medieval village where the gossips around the well would control access to public shame and to the whisper networks within the village, and could wield a considerable amount of informal power, even if nominally their husbands were the head of the household and to be deferred to in every way. Yeah. That's all very well, but if everybody's talking about you behind your back, then in the context of village life, it's who actually has the upper hand there.
There's a stereotype of the wife comes home to the husband, or the husband comes home to the wife rather, and then she just goes, "We're not friends with the neighbours anymore," and that's it. You immediately have to abide by her word because she governs the social texture. Right,
and I mean, a great deal of medieval comedy is about. Really plays on who actually has the upper hand in that context, and the fact that it's on the ground it's much more ambiguous.
That was still the case until the Carry On films.
Well, indeed. So that's the transition into the industrial era, and those ways in which women lost agency in that context, and sought to, and the bourgeois housewife sought to make the case for women in that context still being appreciated and valued, and the domestic realm being appreciated and valued, even if it wasn't a productive household anymore. And it was so, and she'd been demoted really in practice from equal participant in the productive household to something more like chief consumer and educator of children. But the difficulty is that this is all very well if you have a husband who's a good man. Yeah. If in reality he has a great deal more power over you than he would have done previously, because you can't work, or the conventions haven't really caught up with the new reality, and you don't have access to economic agency on the same terms as your husband. You can't access property on the same terms as your husband because a whole set of other legacy medieval laws and conventions. And the political model has also developed in line with the transition into market society from being one where households are the principal unit of the principal political unit, to increasingly individuals within a market society being the principal political unit, and you're still being treated as though you're members of a productive household where you're not in fact productive and you don't have any leverage, which is the situation women found themselves in the 19th century. That's fine if your husband's a good man, but if he's a tyrant, or if he beats you, or he abuses you, or any of the other things that could go really wrong, you have no recourse at all, or at least you pretty much the only circumstances under which you can exit that arrangement is in absolute penury and without your children. And women under those circumstances were right to say, well, this needs to change. So there were campaigners for divorce laws, there were campaigners for the franchise, there were campaigners for property ownership, there were campaigners for the Married Women's Property Act, which I think was the late 19th century in the UK, and I can't remember the exact date in the US. But you can sort of see where all of this is coming from. So on the one hand, you have the cult of domesticity, which is the feminism of care, who are saying, no, actually, motherhood and the domestic realm, this stuff matters. And then on the other hand, you have a set of women who are saying, well, no, actually, under the new order, that's not enough, because it only works if everybody's playing ball. And when things go wrong, we still need to have access to market society on the same terms as men, because otherwise we have no comeback. back. So you have these two poles, the feminism of freedom and the feminism of care. And I could go on for another 3 hours about the back and forth between these two dynamics, which really continued until the mid 20th century. It's an incredibly rich history of political theory, all of which, and up until the mid 1960s. This was conducted within the understanding that women's bodies and women's sexed bodies and women's specific reproductive role just is what it is.
Yep.
And in a sense, we have all the political theory that emerges out of that is a sort of pragmatic response to how this intersects with social and cultural realities and how we balance all of these competing interests in different economic strata. So, but what happened in the 1960s or thereabouts was another tech transition. And in the book, I've argued that this was really the end of the industrial era and the beginning of a new era, which I've called the cyborg era, or if you prefer, the transhumanist era, although I've called it the cyborg era in the book, which ended the back and forth between the feminisms of care and the feminism of care and the feminism of freedom, because the feminism of freedom won definitively by the introduction of birth control and legal abortion, which was a sequence of events. It was a sequence of events, really, in that introducing the pill created a ratchet towards the legalization of abortion, because the arrival of the pill so radically changed sexual norms that there were just a whole lot more unplanned pregnancies happening, which then created political pressure towards the legalization of abortion, which was a bandwagon that was jumped on by existing eugenicist campaigners in favor of legal abortion, who had their own reasons for wanting to make this permissible where it hadn't been before. So, and at that point, wherever you stand on fetal personhood or whatever, I think we can probably agree that, we're in a situation where the needs of a dependent other are perceived as being in zero-sum conflict with my personal autonomy. If that person is dependent on the hospitality of my own body in order for his or her continued existence, and I feel like that's in zero-sum conflict with my autonomy, to say that I can just end that potential life in the interests of my autonomy is about as strong as possible a statement as you can make in favour of autonomy over care.
Yep. So
really, that was the victory of the feminism of freedom over the feminism of care, and this was a conclusion I came to pretty reluctantly, because I internalized as a growing up, I suppose the Clinton era mantra of safe, legal and rare, essentially the idea that it's a grave thing to do and there are some circumstances where there are no good outcomes and perhaps that's the best thing to do, or the least worst thing to do perhaps. And I came very uncomfortably to the conclusion that we should look at it, we should see it as so pivotal to the history of modern feminism, because it was really the buffer that I hit in trying to answer a question which I confronted in my personal life when I had a child, which was, why is care so undervalued? Why is it always second fiddle? Why is it that if you're a stay-at-home mum, as I have been, and you go to a party and people ask you, so what do you do? And you say, oh, I'm a mum. Immediately they're looking over your shoulder. It's less the case if you're talking to conservatives than if you're talking to progressives, but it's the case across the board. If you tell them you're a mum, chances are they're looking over their shoulder for someone more interesting to talk to, because they assume that you don't have anything better to do with yourself. You're probably a bit thick. You're probably a bit useless. And I thought, well, it's not that the fact that I'm pushing a pram round the empty streets of a small town in the Shires, that hasn't made my first from Oxford go away. I'm not thick. I'm not useless. I'm not any of these things. And yet people are now suddenly treating me as though I'm a sort of second-class citizen. Why is that? Why does care always lose against freedom? And I came, and that's really what sent me down the whole rabbit hole of 19th century feminism, which has been pretty much kind of expunged from the modern liberal feminist genealogy. It's been cancelled for a whole host of complicated reasons. But my hypothesis on that is that actually it's because half of it is not legible as feminism, in the aftermath of the victory of the feminism of freedom. But yeah, I'm very, very reluctantly, I came to the conclusion that actually what we're looking at is a situation in which the winners wrote the history books, and the feminism of care has been written out or has been rendered marginal. And really, in pretty much any policy you care to point at in the contemporary world, women's rights are synonymous with greater freedom for women from really the constraints of our own biology. in every, and actually ground zero for that being just an indisputable fact, just an article of faith, if you like, was the point where abortion became legal. Because at that point it was no longer possible. It no longer seemed as possible to say, well, no, there are some situations where women have no choice but to balance these competing interests, because all of a sudden women did have a choice. And now that we do have a choice, making the case for care is just harder. It's just inescapably harder. And so I came reluctantly to the conclusion that legal abortion is a bad metaphysic for any feminist who wishes to mount a defence of women's specific reproductive role and of the needs of dependent anybody, the needs of any dependent person, as against the atomizing power of the market.
So, if I can disentangle a little bit of that, because I want to make two challenges on the framing, not only of you but of, I suppose, your contemporaries in the space. So, to look at that genealogy, it's from the agrarian economy where the products of the joint enterprise of men and women working and struggling upwards together were more self-evident because you'd literally have the products of your own labour laid out in front of you for your own children. And so not only were you less alienated from what you made, but you were less alienated from each other because you were working less further apart and you had more cooperative spheres. And when that moves into the industrial economy, women mounted a spirited defence of their domain of sentiment as separate from the eye of Sauron of encompassing all things into GDP and commerce. And there were lots of men that jumped on that enterprise too, as I put in my article, which is basically a review of your book as well, which for anyone who didn't know, I really enjoyed it as well. So please go out and buy it. John Ruskin, Coventry Patmore, Charles Dickens to large extent, all included female characters and articulated this as the philosophy of the angel in the house or the cult of domesticity. And then as that became slowly incorporated into the state's balance sheet with the transition from the oikos to the individual polis, that was a sort of solvent on social bonds and gendered expectations. And so feminism itself has become now the feminism of individualism. And also, the materialist pressures have taken away the metaphysics which allowed women and men at the time to mount the defence of the cult of domesticity. And the reason I've condensed that and retraced that is because when I spoke to Louise, she started the interview by saying that I'm a materialist. And I challenged some of her Marxist framing, particularly on the idea that OnlyFans women were a sort of productive proletariat for the socio-sexual bourgeoisie, because I said, you kind of left the incel brigade out of there. And she said, oh, actually, that is a dichotomy that works as well. And by the end of the interview, she said, in all but exact words, Christianity is the only thing that saves the West. And so I suppose I'm asking, do we need some sort of spirited, whether it's Christianity or otherwise, renunciation of the material advances, progress, whatever you would want to call it, in order to set back the clock? And is more materialism as a worldview or more feminism, if it has been actually captured, the answer?
Do you want the yes to do we need a spirituality, or do you want a no to is materialism and feminism enough? I mean, because essentially I agree with your point.
Right.
If I've left out religion, yes, it's because I wanted to write a 50,000 word book, not a 150,000 word book.
Right.
You know, you have to make choices about what you're going to focus on, because otherwise you just end up writing everything, which just bores and annoys people. So I mean, one reviewer, I've been laughing about this ever since, accused me of scaling the north face of the Vatican without ropes or pythons.
That's fantastic.
Which I think, well, I mean, yeah, you got me there. And I mean, I'm not a Roman Catholic, but I think on a number of points, I found myself in agreement with a great deal of Catholic social teaching on a great many points.
Well, you did cite Abigail Favale in there, and I'm talking to her next week, and I think her and Louise's book form a little bit of a holy trinity at the moment. So.
Yes, absolutely. I've quoted her in the book, and she's very good on a lot of this stuff. You have to leave some stuff out, and really, what I wanted to do was show that. Well, I'll start from somewhere else. You have to meet people where they are.
Yes.
Now, and where most people are now is not with quotes from the Bible. It's just not.
Yeah, I agree.
But you know that may. You have to meet people where they are, which means that if you want to make a case, even for things which Pope Francis might have said, or some predecessor of Pope Francis might have said, you have to be able to make it in language that isn't structurally reliant on quoting Thomas Aquinas or St. Paul or whoever. You just have to.
You can't just defer to the man in the sky if they don't believe him in the first place.
No, exactly. You're just wasting your breath, and you'll end up talking to a small audience of people who in any case you didn't need convincing anyway.
Literally preaching to the choir.
And I wanted to offer a set of arguments which certainly don't disagree with what Christian religious teaching would say, but it was this has never been about me trying to smuggle in Catholicism by the back door, because I'm not a Roman Catholic, and I mean, in as much as I'm a Christian at all, it's in probably a fairly heretical sense. It remains the tradition that we live in. You know, it remains in the water, no matter how it's contested or indeed pretty borderline persecuted in public life. In the 21st century, it remains in the air and in the water, and I can't but be working and thinking and writing within that tradition. And nonetheless, you have to start from where you are. In term, I don't think it's possible to make that case in a 50,000 word. To make the case for embodiment and solidarity in a 50,000 word book along with the much larger piece, the much larger moral or spiritual piece, without just writing something that's completely chaotic and incoherent. So. It's just a separate project, I think, but it's one which I think needs to happen. It's one that we need. I've said before, I think the hard problem for anybody who takes these questions seriously, the larger metaphysical questions seriously, is trying to find a way back to talking coherently about something in the sort of natural law zone, without having to go via Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, it's basically what C.S. Lewis did with articulating the Tao in Abolition of Man.
Right. Yeah. C.S. Lewis is so often cited at the moment because he's pretty much the only person we have who's had a solid crack at that in the modern age. And I think there's a lot more work to be done on that front. As it's probably a sort of medium-term research project of mine is trying to make a positive contribution on that front. This just wasn't the book for it, basically.
So are you using the term feminism to try and wrestle it away from what has currently been captured as, then? Because it seems to be synonymous, at least in contemporary parlance, with having a monopoly on acting in women's interests, even if they're not doing so.
I mean, the fundamental argument that I want to make in the book is very straightforwardly that I don't think there's a universal or eternal set of. I don't think it's possible to say the following things are universally and eternally going to be the foundations of feminism. If I'm right that feminism as such is the aggregate response to changes in material and cultural and political conditions, then it follows that as material, cultural and political conditions change, so too what it is we're trying to achieve, what women's interests constitute may well change with them. And the case that I've tried to make in the book is that as we've left the industrial era and entered the cyborg era, me supporting women's interests, standing up for women's interests, just means something very fundamentally very different. And pursuing ever more freedom and ever more atomization just is, to me, very, very obviously not in women's interests anymore. Outside of a shrinking elite who are still net beneficiaries of more atomization and line go up and so on.
Yeah.
But for normie women, I think we've pretty much reached peak progress on that front, which doesn't mean, but that doesn't mean that women's interests no longer need defending.
Yep. It
simply means that we need to move the goalposts a bit on what women's interests actually mean. And I've tried to make the case here. I suppose I'm squaring quite an awkward circle between really quite conservative social conservatives on the one hand and radical feminists on the other, which is just not a Venn diagram you expect to have any overlap at all. And yet here we are. really trying to make the case that actually a measure of realism about our dimorphic nature and about our embodied existence in the world and in relation to one another, and our bound upness in relationship to one another, is fundamentally what we need to be leaning into if we're going to stick up for the interests of women and also of men and of children, in defence of the human, in terms of where we are now rather than where we were 50 years ago or 100 years ago.
So you're wrestling the idea of feminism away from being a sort of what Michael Oakeshott would call a rational framework to lay onto the world and make the world fit to it, like a cookie cutter impression, and more towards the Burkean idea of tradition as something that's been time-worn and is particular to a place and is something you can draw upon beyond your own limited stock of reason, but apply it to new and developing circumstances. It's more of an epistemological tool than an ideology.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, or if I were to be mischievous, I could say I'm just modernising.
See, I didn't get much of Mary Wollstonecraft's feminism in this, so I think you're not modernising all of it, thankfully, but sure. Changing gears slightly, this is something that I put in my review article. You have a pretty voracious objection to the tradwife trend. You wrote in an article for UnHerd, the weakness of these proposals isn't that they're unworkable or even that they're traditional, but that they're not traditional enough. For most of history, men and women work together in a productive household, and this is the model reactionary feminism should aim to achieve. So is it that the cult of domesticity is some kind of economic temporal aberration that can't be authentically replicated now? Or is it that we can do it piecemeal with the sort of advent of remote working and part-time working, and that's actually a more optimistic message? It's just that the tradwives are not, they're not making it practical enough. They're kind of making an artifice out of the lifestyle.
Well, I mean, there's several pieces in here which I'll try and unpick one at a time. Number one, I mean, where the material conditions that produced the imaginary 1950s housewife are not coming back anytime soon. At least, if we wanted to go back to that world, we wouldn't start with women. We'd start with reshoring the entirety of manufacturing, reclaiming the British Empire, which created the market for that manufacturing.
I'm listening.
Right, and I mean, if you want to embark on all of this in the as a precursor to bringing back the kind of wealth and the kind of standing for the United Kingdom that enabled mass prosperity on the scale that produced this 1950s housewife, who had access to a range of consumer goods, and also the household had enough money to survive on one income. And I mean, I'm a bit ambivalent about how many of those actually existed. I think historians of good faith disagree on how real this family setup was, or how widespread anyway. And I think nonetheless, the 50s housewife looms large in the imaginary of both the left and the right for different reasons, even if they disagree on what she means or how desirable it is to go back to that. To that world. Anyway, I think what I'm trying to get across is the scale of the undertaking needed to replicate the material conditions in which we have that economic setup, even should we want to achieve that. I don't see that happening anytime soon. And absent that happening, when you look at what a tradwife, quote unquote, is, this is somebody who's making a performance, if you like, of embracing that domestic only realm. Although paradoxically, often they make money out of doing it sort of publicly as a performance on the internet, which actually in practice is its own distinctively modern phenomenon, which is to say you're making money out of creating yourself as an influencer brand on the internet, which is hardly the private domestic only activity. Which it's a very paradoxical phenomenon. Yes. And I surely most of these women realise that and realise the ironies that are baked into that. So that's one of the things which is going on with tradwives. But where I think I have a problem with it is that the number of families for whom it's realistically affordable to support a family on just one income is very small. Being a stay-at-home mum is, when I was briefly a stay-at-home mum for a couple of years, I realised it's a luxury. Having the choice about whether or not to go back to work is a luxury good now. because the economy has changed so much since my mum was raising her kids, that for most people it's simply not affordable to have a trad wife, even if they wanted one. And from that point of view, you could argue that the trad wife meme and the trad, that it's more of a cultural flex than anything else. It's a way of saying, look how well off we are, and look how much more comfortable we are than you. It's aspirational because it's so out of reach, even whether or not. And people say, it's regressive and it's reactionary and it's trying to take us back to the 1950s. Well, no, actually, it's distinctively modern, not least because it's harking back to a set of material conditions which were unique product of modernity and don't reflect the rest of history at all, but also because the entire production of influencers as aspirational content on the internet as a form of money making, where actually what you're doing is showing off how much of a nicer life you have than everybody else. I think that's about as 21st century as it gets. So there's nothing trad about trad wives. Their problem really is that they're not trad enough. And if we were to look seriously and try and think a bit more broadly about what actually a meaningful, realist accommodation to the tensions that exist in women's lives between wanting to work and wanting to be available for our kids, we'd be looking much further back than the 1950s. I would suggest that we look all the way back to the 1450s. Not to say that we should all be going back to scratching out a living on a couple of acres, but that we should be thinking much more in terms of trying to reconstruct a 21st century model of the productive household. And there are any number of different ways that you could be doing that. And I've listed a couple of examples of women who are already doing that, who are building some kind of a blend of. One of them is doing a bit of homesteading, and they're doing a bit of remote teaching, and they're doing some journalism, and it's a sort of portfolio career. But the collective enterprise is oriented towards creating a home which is richly textured with work and also family life, in which these are interwoven, and which prioritizes building a legacy together with their husbands in the long-term interests of their children. And I think there are 1,001 different ways that you could approach that enterprise. And in a world where the majority of us do knowledge work, there's nothing to say that one set of activities should be men's work necessarily, or one set of activities should be women's work. I'm not interested in litigating on anybody else's behalf who takes the bins out. I just couldn't care less about that. It's just it's nobody's business. But if you're trying to rebuild something more like a productive household, the key thing is to think of it all as the work, which just needs to be done in order for your family to flourish. And beyond, and once you see it like that, you figure it out between you. Because everybody's sort of pulling towards the same long-term goal. At least that's the aspiration, really.
Yeah, without a sort of conscious collective ideological renunciation of technological progress, it does seem like we're moving unassailably towards the cyborg technocracy you forecasted. And obviously there are aspiring technocrats who would like it, so that means the confiscation of property and the subscription modelization of everything, and that we're all linked into the metaverse on Robert Nozick experience machines forever. But there's something quite optimistic in what you've said there, and that is that, okay, perhaps tradwife revivalism isn't going to happen as we think, because it occupies such a narrow band of economic history that the conditions are almost irreplicable, but that we can be kind of happy with the compromise of remote work, and with the advent of automation, the eradication of some of those more menial, low-paying jobs that lots of women are forced to do and put their kids in daycare just so they can go swipe things at a checkout at Tesco or something like that. So if the economy does transition, we're at a fork in a road, much like we once were in the Industrial Revolution with feminism of care versus feminism of freedom, where we can actually say, well, no, there are some domains like motherhood that don't need to be on a GDP balance sheet, and we can actually isolate those from the realm of commerce. That would be quite a nice thing to do. I
sincerely hope so. Although I'm not massively optimistic. If you look at recent policy announcements on that front. I mean, there are a couple of points I'd make on that. One of them is that inescapably, whatever it is that you say about this is very class inflected. And what the reality looks like on the ground, if you're a mother who has a job rather than a career, is very different to what it looks like if you do high paid knowledge work which is sort of flexible by its nature. And it's again, I wrote a 55,000 word book, which there isn't space to say, well, what about everybody?
Yes.
And it's my sincere hope that women who are more engaged with life at the life among manual and low skilled workers could challenge me on some of the complexities of trying to negotiate this transition, and trying to apply what I've loosely called reactionary feminism in that context, because I think that would probably produce a very different picture. And I'm a middle class woman who lives in the Shires. Inevitably, I've written a book which is skewed towards the perspective of people who are a bit like me. But to an extent, if you're going to have an implied audience, you just have to make decisions on that front. And I've written this book more or less. The last section of the book is written more or less explicitly for young knowledge class women, of approximately who are basically like me but 20 years younger. In the hope that one or two of them might reverse engineer something which works. Those who want to be mothers without acquiring quite as many battle scars as I did. But actually on that point, I had a really nice conversation yesterday with one of the editors at Law and Liberty in the United States, whose background could not possibly be more different to mine, in that I think she was raised Mormon,
right,
and she's now a Roman Catholic, and she and I have both found ourselves reverse engineering something very similar in terms of our balance of in public and intellectual life and family life, remote working and flexible working, and a double attention both towards public participation in the public sphere and also attention to our families from diametrically opposed political and religious starting points. And we were laughing in the course of the conversation about how if it was sort of convergent evolution, a bit like complete creatures with completely different genetic profiles who somehow managed to evolve crab-like features. If in a sense, if we're facing the same problems, even if we come from quite different places in terms of politics and culture, we've arrived at something like at very similar solutions. And I suppose I've offered my experience and those of other women who are not dissimilar to me, as a possible template for how things might work. If you're going to be a 20-something woman who's broadly like me in terms of class and culture, and who aspires to be who aspires to have a life of the mind as well as a life with kids. And I think it's I'm cautiously optimistic on that front. I think there's hope.
I would love to be, and I'm trying my best. And I think it's very encouraging that disparate people, including people like me, because even though I'm not an ascetic like John Ruskin, but I feel like I'm mounting a similar defense of the angel in the house archetype now with talking to so many of the people in the reactionary feminist sphere. I think that the fact that different people of different walks of life are coming to identify the same thread of the Tao is encouraging. The thing that wasn't encouraging, as you said about policy, as you alluded to a few minutes ago, is that on the back of the book, Michael Gove has given a rousing endorsement. So if politicians can recognise that these are the problems and this is the pathway, why are they still committed to the sort of expedient GDP, line go up, mass migration, disincentivise families doctrine that I think needs to change before actually the more traditional, even before the trad wife lifestyle can be accessible to more women?
The short answer is I think politicians now face an absolutely wicked problem, which is that the welfare state is a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
That's it in a nutshell. That's the tweet, as they say.
Yeah, I have noticed recently the RNC in the States, despite America going completely financially under and all of their allies abandoning them in droves, well, not even just allies, but the enemies that they thought they could have the Golden Arches theory with are now creating BRICS, an alliance, and ditching the dollar as the world reserve currency. The RNC is still putting out hit pieces on Joe Biden, thinking it's really effective, saying that Joe Biden years ago voted to slash Medicare and Medicaid. And it's like, yes, he voted for the only thing that was going to save the Republic at the time. And now the uniparty consensus is in debt all of the upcoming generations for the entitlements that have been promised to the boomers. And I don't want to disparage all the boomers because both my sets of grandparents are still around, and I'm glad they've got their pension to live on so that I can still see them and spend time with them and earn their wisdom. But it's an unsustainable trickle-up model, and it's frustrating that the politicians can read this, see the issue, and still go, but it's not expedient for my electoral career to do that anyway. I don't know what to ask you beyond that, other than just to express my annoyance as a young man that would quite like a family.
Yeah, I hear that. I wish I had a more optimistic take.
Yeah.
I mean, I see it going the way of all Ponzi schemes, and I think it's going to be ugly.
Shifting gears then. So you recently said something that was, I think it was in an interview, it might have been with Chris Williamson, that raised my eyebrow. And this is another thing that I wanted to see if there's a thread between your and Louise's book. You said that if monogamy was culturally asserted and sexual propriety was redone, and if sex was rewilded, that kink culture wouldn't exist. And
I didn't say that.
Well,
but I'll finesse that in a moment. Go on.
Apologies if I've mischaracterized. I wanted to combine that with, there's an article recently that I read that suggests the inverse, that the tradwife trend is, and they trot out all the old ists and phobes, says it's racist, homophobic, transphobic and the like. And so women should consciously choose kink instead.
I read that one, yeah. I know what you mean.
For the benefit of the audience, and we'll link it in the description, it says, kink offers every benefit of tradwifery, but with the improvement of being safe, negotiated and consensual. Kink and sex-positive feminism gives all people, regardless of gender, race, creed, etc., the freedom to live their lives as they see fit. It celebrates people as being kinky as they want to be. And if that means submitting to your husband, then go ahead with your bad self. Any thoughts?
I'm going to have to filter my thoughts for what I want to say on main. So, one of my hypotheses about kink culture is that it functions as a sort of nature reserve for libs who realise that power imbalances are actually just a fact of reality, and they want to make space for that within their own lives without letting it get too dangerous. Which in essence is basically what this woman is arguing. Just seen from the other side, and I think you could, a perfectly legitimate response from a standpoint that says that power imbalances are just a fact of reality, and to an extent, politics is about how we navigate those. You might well ask the inverse: why not do it without safe words? Mm. I think if the no, I am going to say it on main. I'm not going to say it on main. I'm not going to say it on main. That's all I'm going to say about.
Yep. Because that's what.
So that's I think you might well ask. Why not actually just look at the thing for what it is? Why do you have to bracket it and frame it with all of this small print? Mm. Why not just do it straight, do it neat? See,
my theory on this, and I'd said this while we were watching. I don't know if you know Ash Sarkar. Her video on tradwives. I said to Dan, it sounds very much like the sort of paranoia that you need a sort of parachute built in or 1 foot out the door at all times because you're so afraid of being unilaterally exploited that you have to have the idea of consent, or you have to have parallel economic independence so that you can cut your losses at any time if you get the hint of that someone is not fully committed to you.
Yeah.
And that just leads to total atomization. But I think that phrase that you used is a sort of enclosure for people that know they want it but are too afraid to step outside of it. I love that because it's finally sparked that thing in my head, because when I spoke to Louise about it, her book makes the case that because it serves perverse market incentives, like with the release of 50 Shades of Grey and the partnership with Ann Summers, there's a whole booming predatory industry on commercializing what she saw as how some battered housewives feel closest to their partner when he's choking them or hitting them or something like that. She saw that as predatory, and she said that women just need to renounce that. And my challenge to her that I didn't really get much of an answer on, because we both didn't know, was, okay, but if women are going for it, then you're going to have a hard time convincing them. And I think you've just elucidated the dichotomy of exactly how they can be convinced, is that just try and trust within the confines of relationship rather than just trying to have a consensual transaction. So that kind of power imbalance.
Yeah, I think Louise, I broadly agree with Louise's assessment of how this kind of violent exchange within what ought to be an intimate relationship is very often extremely abusive. And I very much admire the work that Louise has done at We Can't Consent to This on really highlighting that and actually getting the law changed in order to remove the quote-unquote rough sex defence. I mean, so absolutely hats off to Louise on that. But kink is actually, the ontology of kink is one of the very few areas where we disagree very slightly. I think there's something that's very subtle and very deep. in what's going on there in terms of how people are trying to get to grips with what power is and how that intersects with sexuality, and I don't think it's as straightforward as this is just a bad meme that's being this is a bad male supremacist meme, which I'm being a bit unfair to Louise's analysis, but that it's a bad meme which is being propagated by pornography and we should just avoid it. I mean, what I said in the book is that, well, I mean, it wasn't quite that kink culture would disappear if we stopped using birth control. It's kind of what I said. But the case I've tried to make is that, in a sense, you know, if you remove the possibility of procreation from sex, it's a little bit, what you get is a bit like vegan bacon, and then inevitably, like it does, you know, it kind of tastes like the real thing, but it's not quite the same as the real thing.
It's a simulacrum, yeah.
Right, and so, you know, is it any wonder that people start adding a lot of hot sauce just to feel anything at all? I mean, that's essentially what I'm saying, and I've tried to make the case that if we think people are consuming too much a lot more hot sauce than is really good for anybody, and that actually that's percolating down so that really, really very young women are unwittingly, you know, snorting chili sauce and finding themselves permanently injured. I'm talking metaphorically,
yes,
but you understand what I'm saying.
I get exactly what you're saying.
Then what we need to do is actually just go back to eating bacon.
Yeah.
Because that eliminates the basic structural problem, which is causing hot sauce to propagate like wildfire through the culture, where really it's not necessary to enjoy the full flavour of what it is of the original.
Yeah, I would encourage nobody mix up hot sauce and that activity. By the way,
no, absolutely do not
involve
hot sauce in any of the activities that we're talking about. Absolutely no way. Don't do that. I'm speaking strictly metaphorically here, but yeah, I think it's, you know, if you don't want the disappointing experience of vegan bacon, don't eat vegan bacon.
You mentioned the pill, so what's to be done?
What is to be done? Don't take the pill. You know, don't encourage your friends to take the pill.
Yep. So, sure, and I've met plenty of women who have said as such. Especially because as we go over the alarming amount of evidence that says it's leaked into the water supply, is at the same time that the contraceptive pill came about, there was a New York and an Israeli university study that saw over the last 50 years male sperm counts have dropped about 60%. That's obviously to do with plastics and things in the water as well, but if 90% of the pill is secreted out and it's changing fish species and it can't be filtered out of water, it's not a great thing. And then there's also the internal physiological effects of mass medicating women from the age of 13, 14 upwards to, as Abigail Favale puts it, make sure that their mode of biological reproduction is off rather than on.
Yeah. Which
is a completely new thing to wrap your brain around. All of those things, and I think it will propagate like a cultural meme that it isn't in women's interests. Are you... So Louise in our chat, sorry to keep bringing her opinions up as a contrast, but she said that what she would actually advocate for is not prescribing it for unmarried women. Do you think that has any merit, or would you favour just a cultural intervention at this stage?
I prefer to leave policy suggestions to more policy-oriented people at this point. My interest, as things stand, is in bluntly making the pill low status.
Yeah.
And I think that's the only way. That's the only way we turn the tide on this, is to make it. And in fact, that's how fashions propagate. And I see that happening already in a sort of subcultural way. But really, an amazing amount of human culture is downstream of what the hot girls do. And if the hot girls decide that taking the pill is just not a thing anymore, then things will change. You know, this is. I'm not a member of that group and haven't been for some time. I'm a middle-aged mum now, and I'm a long way, many years on the shelf. And this particular push isn't really for me to spearhead. But this is my suggestion. You know, there are a great many social evils can be tackled in creative new ways. We can move the ball on a lot of things that feel immovable, if and when a critical mass of influential young women decide that this is just not a thing we're going to do anymore.
It's the Lysistrata effect.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'm cautiously hopeful that could actually happen.
So you've already touched on abortion slightly, and I wanted to disentangle your case on it, just because, of course, as well, I feel like I'm obliged in interviews to try and make them as novel as possible, so that everyone doesn't just go have to watch every other interview, and so it really makes the case for the book specifically. I watched your chat on UnHerd with Freddie, I believe it was, and you said that, and as you've already said here, that the renegotiation of the inviolability of the personhood of an unborn baby was the tipping point that really meant that feminism of freedom took supremacy over feminism of care. Mm-hmm. But you also said that repealing abortion access would have disastrous consequences for women in the present, particularly because of the cultural changes of the contraceptive pill, which still need some time to walk back. I struggle with this, particularly as someone who is very deontologically against abortion from the perspective of humility of I never know when the onset of a life is, therefore I've just ward off taking it. To me, that seems to play in the sort of dialectical idea that those in favour of progress also engage in. And because all of the superstructures of power, including the Labour Party spearheaded by, I think, the archetype of the devouring mother, that is Stella Creasy, who wants to make abortion at all stages into the British Bill of Rights. And now Humza Yousaf today has just proposed that for Scotland. I would challenge the idea that we can take an incremental process approach to something that seems to be morally absolute in terms of human life. And also, it would feel like we're ceding ground if we didn't say we're going to take this stance, whether you like it or not. I understand that might not sit well with you, but I just want your thoughts
I think
on that.
These are completely valid points, and I really went back and forth on where I should land on this particular issue, because I considered everything that you just said, and I mean one of the factors, as you say, is that one of the factors which I've noted in the book is that the maximalists are on manoeuvres. And so for all that, for some time now, we've had a fairly settled consensus on, fairly liberal, but not maximalist provisions across the United Kingdom. It's my sense that we can't rely on that continuing to be the case because the maximalists are on manoeuvres. And therefore, in the first instance, we need to be able to mount a defence of just standing still. So that would be. And in the interests of building actually a broad enough coalition to mount a defence, even of just staying still, I've opted for a more moderate stance than I could perhaps have done, right. Because I think there's a great deal of common ground that I have as an ambivalent. Somebody who's deeply ambivalent about abortion, with other feminists who are ambivalently in favour of its continued availability. I think there's a lot of common ground for a sex realist work that we could approach together, and I want to build a broad coalition. I think it's immensely important to build a broad coalition, and if in the interests of that, I've somebody else said, well, you've just pulled your punches there, Mary, and that's essentially what you're saying as well, yeah. That I've just pulled my punches there, and yeah, because I think sometimes you have to be a bit pragmatic, and also I think if it were banned tomorrow, it would be an absolute disaster for women, because the entire architecture of our social mores around sex and sexuality are now such that are premised on the existence of this as the final backstop. And if it were removed tomorrow, I think the end result would be something more like Ceausescu's Romania. Than and maybe perhaps that would change over time. I don't know. And perhaps perhaps there are radicals on the pro-life side who would say it would be worth it to get there. But I don't think that's the only possible outcome. Particularly when you consider how drastically post-Christian our society is. I think it's equally plausible that we would end up with babies abandoned by the side of the road, as we did prior to the Christian era under the Romans. So I mean, this is an area I think about a lot, and my stance on it is not settled. Because the situation in the wider world is changing. I think really what I want to underline is that the case, the challenge I've wanted to mount in the book is not against those feminists for whom it's a grave, but who make a sincere good faith case that it's a grave thing to do, but is sometimes the least worst course of action. There are many feminists of good faith who are fundamentally sex realists, and who make that case from an embodied and a relational perspective. And although I have some metaphysical differences with that approach, it's one that I can respect because I think we fundamentally share a desire to honour the realities of what it's like to be a woman with our distinctive reproductive physiology. And the people who I'm pushing back against, and really the stance that I'm pushing back against, is the maximalist one, the cyborg one, that just says we can do this at any time for any reason because freedom is the only thing that matters. Those are the people who I think who are, and really I want to make the case to a number of those ambivalently pro-choice feminists that in fact they and I share a common enemy in these people. And what we do in the longer term from a policy point of view is still up for discussion.
Okay, so it's more a practical consideration aiming at the lessening of the amount of dead babies, to put it bluntly, but you're out of a bit of pessimism in the execution, not willing to push so hard on the issue yet. Am I correct in that assessment? Broadly speaking, yeah. I mean, I think it's one of those. This is one of those scenarios where there are just sometimes no good outcomes, and you can have one set of trade-offs, or you can have another set of trade-offs, and in which set you choose depends on your metaphysical priors. And actually, I think we need the conversation that I would prefer us to be having would be more about the metaphysical priors, because otherwise we're just going to generate more heat rather than more light. So what I've tried to do is step back from the situation as it is on the ground and to say, no, actually, some of these, we need to relitigate some of these metaphysical priors, because otherwise we're just not going to get anywhere. Yeah, we need to reevaluate the axioms upon which we're operating in order to make better policies. Exactly. Okay. Speaking of the axioms upon which we operate, you make the case for post-romantic marriage. Now, this was one of the most interesting parts that I think a lot of people have picked up on. And we did this recently for my colleague Stelios, who is a philosophy lecturer at the University of York. He has a series called Symposium, and he sits there contending with philosophical ideas. And we had about a 2-hour conversation on the definition of love, because it's always something, I think, someone who was born very much in that post-neoliberal, post-end of history ash heap of civilization, where a lot of our metaphysical presuppositions have been entirely hollowed out, and we're having to excessively rationally reconstruct them. I think that's what the red pill movement really is. That's why they're grounding things in evolutionary psychology, or the opposite to the feminists who are against tradwifery and mutual codependency, who say we need total economic independence. The guys going their own way, who have, like me, I'm sure, been burned by one too many bad exes and have just gone, to hell with it, I'll be entirely independent. I think we're trying to rationally reconstruct what was otherwise an instinct or a tradition because we've been so distant from it. And so I think Stelios and I got there in our 2-hour conversation, but the fact that it took a 2-hour conversation to read a lot of books about it, to just get to the core of it, means that we're in a pretty sorry state. For you, I wanted to ask, is there a definition of love which is one of those metaphysical things that you've been contending with in this book, divorced from the just anti-practical, self-development maximizing soulmate idea that is being advanced, that is causing people to split apart? And is that what you're, having looked into history and seeing that mutual cooperation, is that what you're advancing rather than just the capital B, capital R, big romance? I suppose I would submit that what actually matters in practice is how you show up for one another. Not whether you like each other's Instagram stories or even really share the same opinions on this or that. What actually matters in real life is how you show up for each other, or how you show up in the world, full stop. I mean, I can think of, there are plenty of people who feel an intense connection with person X who lives 4,000 miles away and they believe they're their soulmate. But is this person going to drive them to hospital if they suddenly come down with a debilitating condition? Is this person going to show up and wipe their ass? These are the questions which actually matter. Does this, and when you talk about growing old together, I mean, I think about my grandparents growing old together, and that's much more of that than even I in middle age really want to think about is about really quite practical stuff, and the foundation of what actually matters there is whether you're going to continue showing up for the other person. Even if you've annoyed each other that morning, or even if life isn't going so well. And what I've
I think there's a romance to that, and there's a beauty to that, which is very underrated. And I've sought in the book to contrast that, to offer that as an alternate, as a set of aspirations, an alternate model to build on and to build with, in opposition to what I see as a very consumerist, the capstone marriage, as it is, or the self-expressive marriage, if you prefer. This idea that that you get married as the sort of final piece once you've made it in all of the other ways, which implicitly therefore matter more. You've attained a certain position in your career, you've got a house, you've probably even had kids together, and getting married is the kind of final piece, which says that you've attained all of the other things. That dovetails with the self-expressive idea, which I've also challenged in the book, which really I think is a byproduct of the fact that men and women aren't interdependent necessarily in an economic sense, just at the sort of brute material level. Even under the cult of domesticity era, I've argued that companionate marriage, which is beautifully delineated in the work of Jane Austen, I think she's the pioneer of propagating that model for big romance, and really it had some very practical groundings for women, because if you are effectively rendered economically inactive and lacking formal political power or really any economic agency at all, it really is in your interest to find a husband who loves and respects you, for pretty obvious reasons. So the companionate marriage in that context, serves to modulate what is actually an incredibly asymmetrical set of economic and political circumstances, and was very. And so it's no wonder that so many romance novels and sort of princess stories proliferated under those circumstances, because it was communicating something really important to women, which is that if you're going to end up economically dependent on some guy for 30, 40, however many years, you better make sure he loves you. This is fairly, but of course now women enter the workplace. We can control our own fertility. We are effectively independent. With some qualifications for the gender pay gap, which is really the motherhood pay gap, and so on and so forth. But to the extent that you want to be as a woman, you can be one of the sisters who's doing it for themselves. You can fly as high as you like, in pretty much any profession you care to name, and therefore that entire model isn't strictly necessary anymore. The idea that women exchange sexual access for resources just doesn't really hold under 21st century conditions, or even really those late 20th century conditions. And so the self-expressive marriage, or the capstone marriage, has emerged as a reframing of marriage as a sort of consumer good. It's an optional consumer thing, or a vector for self-actualization at best. And implicitly also in that lurks the idea that if it's not delivering for you, you can send it back to the shop like any other consumer product, and you can exit your marriage for any time at any reason. Which obviously has negative consequences for any children who've been produced in the course of that marriage, because you and I both know what the numbers are on children of divorce. They're not great. But this is where we are, and to a significant extent, it's a byproduct of the economic conditions under which men and women form or don't form families today. And what I've set out to argue in the book is that, in fact, if the central premise on which we're basing this idea of a self-expressive marriage is that actually there's enough economic abundance that we could be on our own if we wanted to, then I would respectfully question how sustainable that's going to be into the future. We've talked a lot about line going up and about the dwindling prospects for young millennials and your generation, and the sense that the welfare state Ponzi scheme is probably going to hit the wall sooner or later. And under those circumstances, I would suggest to anybody who's thinking seriously about forming a family that treating marriage like a consumer good is just not a very prudent way to go about it, and that actually going through life with somebody who's able and willing to show up for you, even under the most dire circumstances, is an extremely good idea. And it's a especially good idea if you want to have kids, because obviously it's mothers thrive to the extent in direct proportion to how well supported they are by their wider communities. Not being alone is a much nicer way to raise kids, and this ought to be this is well demonstrated by the statistics and also just by observation. And given all of this, I think we should abolish big romance. We just need to can the whole idea that marriage is a consumer good that you can bin, sack off at any moment because the world will somehow catch you and break your fall. And I just don't think it's true. Certainly not for your generation, that the world is going to break your fall if you sack it off at any moment. And I think more solidarity is in everybody's interests, men and women. We all need a bit of a freedom haircut, I would suggest. And certainly I want to make as emphatically as possible the feminist case for more solidarity for every woman of your age who thinks seriously about becoming a mother. You'd be mad not to find a values aligned, steady partner who you can trust to show up for you. And that's priority number one, not whether he gives you the warm and fuzzies. If he's a bit rude sometimes or a bit, leaves his socks on the bedroom floor, it's probably less important than whether or not he's going to drive you to the hospital, should you need it.
So I don't know how valuable my testimony is here, but I think to combine all that you've said there, which I wholeheartedly agree with going back to the early point in the conversation about Louise talking about the abolition of kink, that's her uphill battle. I think this is far more likely to succeed because it's grounded than her position on kink is in the realities that predated big romance. But I do think it's going to be an uphill battle because, speaking from personal experience, all that you said there about the practical side of love sounds like the approach that pretty much every man has from instinct, and the deep well of sentiment that is meant to be conjured forth, which is nice and happy and romantic, is something that a woman tries to pull out of most modern men who are more duty oriented and who really do just have that affirmative vision of, I want to protect and provide for a wife and kids for the rest of my life. And I feel like there are economic pressures in the way. And I think that the holdover of the Austen, very heavily sentiment-focused approach to romance, which was due to economic interdependency, has now set a very high bar of expectations for men specifically, that you're meant to meet not only all the woman's emotional needs, but that also you are meant to meet some material needs to spoil her and make her feel nice, and we're more than happy to do that. I mean, that's why there's that meme as well of how can men live like this, where they just have a mattress on the floor, a TV on a box, and takeout food, because men don't really spend that much money on that many things unless you're sort of addicted to video games or OnlyFans or something like that. So we are happy to spend money on you, but also that the woman at all times should have some kind of one foot out the door approach to economic independency. So she does have, if you aren't constantly meeting that high bar of protection, provision, and emotional validation, which you are also competing with the entire world for, because she can post a photo at any time and get a bunch of breadth-based validation rather than depth-based validation, it's very hard for dutiful young men to actually break this mindset. And that's why I'm glad you're tackling it from within the paradigm, as we spoke about before. But I do think it's going to be a uphill battle out of all of these issues that you're going to tackle. Yeah.
At the end of the day, I'm not, you can either listen to me or not.
I hope you do.
At the end of the day, nobody's obliged to do what I say, obviously. All I can say is that from where I'm sitting, being willing to tie yourself to the mast and just say, no, actually, this is just being able to put aside optionality is life-changing in ways which are just not accessible from the commitment to optionality side of the mirror. It's like going through the looking glass and you come out somewhere different. That's a somewhere which is very difficult to talk about publicly. But it's transformative and in an overwhelmingly positive way. But this is just, it's something that you have to do. You can't, ask somebody who's done it about it in person and maybe they'll tell you, but it's not something which can really be described on main. And I speak directly to young women in saying that, especially if you want to have kids, it's go through the looking glass. I recommend it.
Lovely. I'm just going to read that bit here. So here's a perfect one to end on. Last question. I was obviously encouraged to see that someone else challenged the Fukuyama paradigm. And you particularly called out how we're living in the Rousseauian general will state of the sort of atomized savage roaming about in a civilization of abundance as if it's a state of nature, with the eye of the state watching us at all times, but that we're sedating our consciences with somatic pleasures so that we don't form relationships, because that's somehow how mankind existed before. And there was a little passage that I copied from this. Women have joined men in embracing the Rousseauian vision of autonomous personhood and rejecting caring obligations as an obstacle to individual self-realization. So in turn, care has been institutionalized, proceduralized, and depersonalized, all the way down to infancy. In the wake of this shift, a generation has grown up that regards the suffocating care of a risk-averse third-party pseudo-parent not as the enemy of their individual flourishing, but as its enabling condition. So, after speaking about all the optimistic paths that we're going to struggle nobly upwards together to make sure that people can have long, happy lives of companionship and family, what happens if none of that is achieved and we keep going down the Rousseauian path? What do you think is going to happen?
I guess a sort of universal state of infantilized totalitarianism, sucking on the teat of the cyborg mother.
So yeah, we really do have a lot to lose here, don't we? Now, the last paragraph I just wanted to read out in case nobody was convinced still yet to buy it by all of your incredible articulations, including calling trans identification Gnostic meat Lego, which is just one of my favourite monikers that I'm going to carry forward personally, and of course cite you for it. It ends with, this is the last paragraph, which looks at the completely desolated landscape of sex, relationships, our thick conceptual idea of coming together and having that cultural continuity. And it says, this is as it should be. There is very little left to conserve, but that in turn means there's everything to build. It doesn't matter that in turn means there's everything to build. It doesn't matter if your orientation is the personal one of the social fabric more broadly. The personal and political are, as ever, the warp and welt of that social fabric. And for as long as there's been a history of women, that history records us weaving. And I think that's just a brilliant note to end on. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for writing the book and for sending it to me. For everyone that hasn't read it or hasn't checked out all of your prior interviews and the like, they are listed in the description. Please go up and pick a copy. When's the US actual book launch?
25th of April, the US publication is out.
Perfect. So our international audience will be able to get that. And I look forward to the 150,000 one you inevitably write and come back into the studio to chat to us about. But cheers for coming in. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.